The horse stopped first. That was what caught Bramwell Voss's attention. A thirsty cow might hesitate, a tired mule might stumble, but a ranch horse that refused river water in the middle of an Arizona summer was trying to say something. The old gray gelding stood at the edge of the Verde River, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring toward the water. Bramwell tightened his grip on the reins. The morning sun was already climbing. Heat shimmered above the dry grass. Dust hung over the valley like a faded blanket. Every creek for miles had shrunk to muddy scars. The cattle needed water, yet the horse would not take another step. Bramwell swung down from the saddle. His boots sank into wet sand. The river looked calm, too calm. If you're riding with this old story, subscribe before the river shows what it swallowed. Then he saw the rope. A man doesn't forget a rope like that. A fresh length of rope was tangled deep in the roots of a cottonwood tree. Not weathered, not old. Fresh cut, fresh tied. Would you have stepped closer? His eyes narrowed. Someone had been here recently. The old rancher followed the rope with his gaze. A few feet away, something flashed in the water. Blue beads. Apache beads. They drifted slowly along the surface before disappearing beneath a patch of floating reeds. Bramwell felt a knot form in his stomach. He had spent enough years in Arizona territory to know what those beads meant. He looked around. No campfire. No wagon tracks. No signs of a fishing party. Nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that felt forced. Men can fake a story. A riverbank usually can't. A dragonfly skimmed the water. Somewhere behind him, a fence board creaked in the heat. Then he noticed the mud. The riverbank had been torn apart. Deep boot prints. Dragon marks. Broken reeds. Signs of a struggle. The old scout inside him woke up immediately. Something had happened here. Something recent. Something ugly. He moved along the shoreline slowly. The horse remained behind him, restless and uneasy. A few yards farther downriver, an object bumped softly against the bank. Bramwell stepped forward and pulled it from the water. It was an Apache leather bag, old, hand-stitched, water-soaked, heavy. His pulse quickened. The bag should not have been there. Neither should the rope. Neither should the beads. Most of all, there should have been a body. But there wasn't. That was the part that bothered him. Someone had clearly tried to hide something, yet the river had delivered the evidence and kept the secret. Bramwell opened the bag. Inside was a folded piece of paper, swollen from water and nearly torn in half. Only a few words remained readable. Protection. Scout. Family. Safe passage. The old rancher's jaw tightened. He had seen words like those before, years ago. Words that had promised safety. Words that had often ended in graves. A sudden splash echoed from upstream. Not a fish, not a bird. Something heavier, something alive. Bramwell looked toward the cottonwoods. The sound had come from behind the bend. He stuffed the torn paper back into the bag and started running. Because if someone had been thrown into the Verde River to bury a secret, there was only one question that mattered now. Had the river spared a witness, or had it only delayed the killing? Bramwell found her before the river finished the job. That was the only way Bramwell could explain it later, if anyone had been around to ask. He came around the bend at a run, boots slipping on the wet clay, one hand grabbing a low cottonwood branch to keep from going down. The gray gelding had followed without being told, splashing through the shallows behind him, still uneasy, still blowing hard through its nose. Then he saw her. She was wedged against the base of a massive cottonwood root, half submerged, her arms bound behind her with the same rope he had found tangled upstream. The current had done its work on her. Her buckskin dress was torn and waterlogged. Her face was pale beneath the brown, lips faintly blue. A dark cut marked her left shoulder, where the rope had bitten through the cloth. She was young, 20, maybe a few years more, and she was still breathing. Bramwell did not hesitate. He waded into his thighs, the cold water a shock, even in the Arizona heat, grabbed the rope and pulled. The roots had her snagged tight. He worked the knot with both hands, fingers numb, the current pushing against him the whole time. When she finally came loose, she came all at once, and he nearly lost his footing pulling her onto the bank. He laid her on her back in the grass and checked her breathing. Shallow, but steady. A pulse at her throat, faint and fast. He cut the rope from her wrists with his knife. The marks it left behind told him she had been tied for some time. He built no fire. He made no noise. He simply knelt in the grass beside her and waited, watching the tree line, watching the river, watching the trail that ran back toward the road. Whatever had put her in that water might still be close. They had not left her there to die slowly. They had tied her where the current would make death look accidental. It took several minutes before she stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, dark and frightened, and she scrambled backward before she even knew where she was. Bramwell held up both hands and stayed exactly where he was, giving her space, giving her time. She looked at the river, then at the rope on the ground, then at him. He expected relief, gratitude, something close to either. What he got instead stopped him cold. "Don't take me back to the soldiers." Her voice was hoarse, nearly swallowed by the sound of the river, but the fear behind it was unmistakable. This was not the fear of a woman who had nearly drowned. This was something older and deeper than that. Bramwell looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not a soldier," he said quietly. She did not look convinced. He reached for the Apache leather bag he had carried from downstream and set it on the ground between them without a word. She stared at it. Then she pulled it toward her with both hands and held it against her chest like it was the most important thing left in the world. Maybe it was. Because Bramwell already knew what was inside it. He had read enough of that torn paper to understand that this young woman was not a runaway. She was not a hostile. She was something the Army feared far more than either of those things. She was a witness. And someone had decided the Verde River was a cleaner solution than letting her talk. The problem was simple. Witnesses can run. Paper can survive. He did not bring her through the front door. That much he knew before they even reached the ranch. Bramwell led the gray gelding off the main trail a quarter-mile out, cutting through the dry brush where the ground was hard and would hold no tracks worth reading. Miva rode without complaint, one hand gripping the saddle horn, the other pressed against her shoulder where the wound had begun to bleed again through the strip of cloth he had wrapped around it. She kept that hand there longer than pain required. She said nothing the entire ride. Neither did he. The ranch was quiet when they arrived. A handful of cattle stood motionless in the far pasture. A hawk circled high above the water trough. The kind of stillness that felt normal, ordinary, the kind that had nothing to hide. Bramwell wanted to keep it that way. He helped her down near the back of the property and walked her to the hay barn, away from the house, away from the road. It was dim inside and smelled of dry grass and leather and old wood. He cleared a space behind the stacked bales and laid out a bedroll. "Stay low," he told her. "Don't move toward the doors. Don't make a sound you don't have to." She looked at him with those dark, careful eyes and said nothing. But she sat down. That was enough. Bramwell unsaddled the horse, washed up at the pump, and walked to the house to gather what he needed: bandages, water, a strip of dried beef. Before he left the barn, he placed a small knife beside the bedroll, close enough for Meva to reach, but far enough that she could choose it herself. He moved quickly and without waste, the way a man moves when he knows time is already working against him. He was halfway back across the yard when he heard the horses. Not one. Several. He stopped. 4 riders came through the front gate at a steady trot, dust rising pale behind them in the afternoon heat. Bluecoats. Cavalry. The man at the front rode with the particular straightness of someone who expected the world to arrange itself accordingly. Lieutenant Orrin Vale. Bramwell had never met the man, but he knew the type well enough. Young enough to trust the papers in his hand. Old enough to know what those papers could bury. Vale pulled up short and looked down from the saddle with the flat, practiced expression of a man delivering news he had already decided was not negotiable. "Bramwell Voss," he said. Not a question. "That's right," Bramwell said. "We're tracking a hostile Apache courier. Young woman. Dangerous. She was transporting stolen military communications before she fled custody." Vale paused just long enough to let the words settle. "We have reason to believe she came through this area this morning." Bramwell looked at him steadily. He had heard those words before. Not from Vale specifically, but from men who wore the same coat and carried the same easy certainty. Hostile. Fled custody. Dangerous. The language never changed much. Only the names did. "Haven't seen anybody," Bramwell said. Vale studied him for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, and gestured to his men. They fanned out without being told. Bramwell watched them move toward the barn and felt his jaw tighten. He had maybe 30 seconds before the nearest soldier reached the side door. He had maybe 30 seconds to decide what kind of man he still was. He made his decision before the soldier touched the latch. He moved fast for a big man, always had. He came around the corner of the barn hard, put his shoulder into the nearest soldier and drove him into the wall before the young man could turn around. The second soldier was reaching for his rifle when Bramwell caught the barn door on its swing and sent it crashing into him. The man went down hard into the hay dust and did not get back up quickly. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of fight anyone would retell with admiration. Bramwell used a shovel handle, a length of bridle leather, and 230 pounds of stubborn determination to put both men on the ground and keep them there long enough to matter. Vale shouted from outside. Hooves scrambled on dry dirt. "Go," Bramwell said, pulling Meva up from behind the bales. "Now!" They went out the back, through the gap in the fence he had never gotten around to fixing, and pushed hard toward the old ferry crossing on the Verde River. It was the one way out that Vale would not expect, because it was the one way out that most men would consider a dead end. Bramwell had always found dead ends more useful than people gave them credit for. They rode hard and they rode low, pushing through the scrub brush that lined the river's eastern bank, cottonwood branches slapping at them as they went. Bramwell kept his eyes on the trail ahead and his ears turned back toward the sound of pursuit. He could hear Vale's men, not close yet, but not far enough. The ferry crossing was another mile, maybe less. If they could reach it before the cavalry flanked around through the upper road, they had a chance. It was during a brief stretch of open ground, when the only sounds were hoofbeats and hard breathing, that Meva heard it. Vale's voice carried across the flats, sharp and furious, shouting orders to his men. Find Bramwell Voss. Cut them off at the crossing. She went very still in the saddle. Bramwell felt it immediately. The subtle shift in weight behind him. The change in her breathing. "You know that name," he said. It was not a question. She was quiet for a long moment. "My father knew it," she finally said. "He talked about a scout. A big man, gray hat, yellow bandana. Said he was the one who led the soldiers to our camp the summer they took everyone away." Bramwell said nothing. The horse kept moving. He had known this moment might come someday. He had simply never figured out what words would fit inside it. "Your father was right," he said at last. "I led them there. I believed what they told me, that it would be a negotiation, that the families who had helped the army would be protected." He paused. They weren't, and I filed no protest. I told myself there was nothing I could do, and I went back to my ranch, and I tried to forget the whole thing. The tree line thickened ahead. The river glittered through the gaps in the brush. "Did you?" Miva asked. "No," he said quietly. "Not a single day." Behind them a horse whinnied somewhere across the flats. Neither of them turned around. She did not respond to that. There was nothing easy to say, and she did not try to manufacture anything. She simply sat with it, the way people sit with old injuries that have healed wrong, that ache when the weather changes and never fully stop. The ferry landing came into view through the cottonwoods, a weathered dock, a flat-bottomed barge tied to iron cleats, the river running low and slow beyond it. And Vale. He was already there. 3 soldiers flanked him on either side, rifles across their saddles, positioned at the edge of the dock, with the calm precision of men who had chosen their ground carefully. Vale himself sat his horse in the center, one hand resting on his thigh, watching Bramwell and Miva emerge from the tree line with an expression that carried no surprise whatsoever. He had not chased them here. He had read Bramwell the way a hunter reads a lame horse. He had known where they would go. "End of the road, Voss," Vale called out. His voice was even and almost pleasant. "Bring the woman forward, and this stops here." Bramwell pulled the horse to a halt at the edge of the clearing. He looked at the soldiers. He looked at the dock. He looked at the river behind them, low and slow and offering nothing useful. Vale reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it up without unfolding it. "Whatever she showed you," he said, "whatever that torn paper claims, it carries no legal standing. The official record reflects pacification duty, properly authorized and properly executed. There is no promise. There is no agreement. There is nothing." Bramwell looked at the document in Vale's hand. Then he looked at Miva. She was watching Vale with an expression he recognized. Not fear exactly. Something harder than fear. The look of a person who has watched the same trick performed before and understands precisely what the hands are doing, even while the audience is still confused. "Pacification duty," Bramwell repeated slowly. "That is the official record," Vale said. "I know what the official record says," Bramwell replied. "I know who writes those records, and I know what they write over when they need the page to read clean." Vale's pleasant expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "You are interfering with a military operation," Vale said. "That is a serious matter, Mr. Voss." "So is throwing a woman into a river," Bramwell said. The words landed in the silence between them and stayed there. Vale straightened slightly in the saddle. His hand moved off his thigh. Whatever was going to happen next was going to happen fast. Bale moved first. He did not draw his sidearm. He simply nodded, the small, deliberate nod of a man who has already calculated the outcome and found it acceptable, and his soldiers raised their rifles. "Last time," Bale said, "the woman and the bag." Bramwell did not move. He stood at the edge of the dock with the river behind him and 6 armed men in front of him, and he did the only thing left available to a man in that position. He bought time. "You want the bag," he said. "Fine, it's yours." He reached slowly into the saddlebag and produced the Apache leather bag and held it out. Vale gestured to the nearest soldier, who walked forward to take it. What Vale did not know, what none of them knew, was that Miva had removed the torn paper before they left the barn. She had folded it small and pressed it flat against the wound on her shoulder, tucking it beneath the strip of bandage cloth Bramwell had wrapped there. The bag Vale's soldier carried back across the dock was real. The beads were real. The water stains were real. The paper was gone. For the first time all day, Vale looked surprised. Vale opened the bag. He looked inside. He turned it upside down. The moment his eyes came back up, Bramwell was already moving. He hit the nearest soldier with his full weight, driving the man sideways into the iron cleat at the edge of the dock. Metal rang hard across the dock. The soldier went down, and his rifle skittered across the boards and dropped into the shallows. What followed was not a clean fight. It was the kind of violence that happens in tight spaces with too many bodies and not enough room for anyone to do what they trained for. Bramwell absorbed 2 hard blows to the ribs before he got his hands on Vale, and when he did, he used the dock rope, looping it around the lieutenant's forearm and pulling with everything he had left. Vale went face first into the mud at the river's edge, cursing and scrambling, his authority dissolving into the same brown water he had used to try and silence Miva. Across the dock, Miva moved. She was hurt, and she was exhausted, and she was precise. She found the single rope that held the ferry barge against the current, a thick hemp line pulled taut against the iron post, and she cut it with the knife Bramwell had given her back at the barn. The barge swung hard on the remaining line. The soldier standing at the far end of the dock lost his footing and went into the shallows with a crash that sent water spraying across the boards. It was enough. Bramwell grabbed Miva's arm, and they went into the tree line on the far side of the crossing, moving fast and low through the brush, while Vale's remaining men pulled their lieutenant from the mud and tried to reestablish some version of order behind them. They did not stop moving for a long time. When they finally did, it was because Bramwell could no longer ignore what his ribs were telling him. He leaned against a tree in the fading afternoon light and breathed carefully, and looked at what Miva had pressed into his hand during the run. It was not just the torn paper from the bag. It was a second page, smaller, folded tighter. A page of handwritten notations with corrections marked in different ink, where one hand had written a promise of safe passage for cooperating Apache families, and a second hand had crossed it through and written pacification duty in its place. 2 hands, 2 inks. One document that told the whole story of how a promise becomes a crime and a crime becomes official record. Bramwell suddenly understood why they had tried to drown her. Bramwell stared at it for a long time. They reached the telegraph station near Camp Verde as the last light left the sky. The operator was a thin young man who looked at the two of them, at the blood and the mud and the hard purpose in Bramwell's eyes, and decided without being asked that whatever this was, it was above his pay grade to argue with. Bramwell kept the message short. He had learned years ago that the truth does not require decoration. Witness, alive. Documentation of falsified military reports in hand. Delivering to Prescott, Voss. The operators sent it without a word. Outside, Meva sat against the station wall in the cooling night air and tended to Bramwell's ribs with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned field medicine the hard way. She tore a clean strip from the hem of her dress and worked without being asked, her hands steady despite everything the day had taken from her. Bramwell watched the dark hills and said nothing. After a while, Meva reached up and touched the yellow bandana at his throat. It was stiff with dried blood and dust and the accumulated weight of the day. She held it between her fingers for a moment without pulling it loose. "You came back for me," she said. Bramwell looked at her. "Should have come back for your people long ago," he said. She did not answer that. She did not need to. She simply let go of the bandana and went back to work, and the silence between them was the kind that holds more than words can carry anyway. They slept in shifts. When the first gray light came up over the eastern hills, Bramwell was already awake, already watching. He had spent too many years reading this country to sleep through a dawn without checking what it brought with it. What it brought was dust, a thin column of it rising from the far ridge, catching the early light the way only moving horses can make dust rise. He counted the shapes as they crested the hill and kept counting, past the point where counting still felt useful. This was not Vale with 3 men. This was something deliberate, something organized, something that had been put in motion by people with more authority than a single lieutenant at a river crossing, people who had decided that one witness and one old rancher and one torn piece of paper represented a problem large enough to bury properly this time. Bramwell looked at Meva. She was already on her feet, already watching the ridge with him, the folded pages pressed against her side beneath the bandage. The telegraph message was sent. The truth was in motion somewhere ahead of them. But the men coming over that hill did not answer to telegraph offices or to truth. They answered to the same people who had rewritten that document in different ink. And they were riding hard, and the morning was still very young. That torn paper tucked under Meva's bandage is the part that sticks in my craw, because that's usually where the truth ends up, hidden close to the wound, while some clean-handed fella in an office writes a prettier lie. Back in 1886, Chiricahua Apache scouts like Caida and Martin helped bring Geronimo in. They did what the Army asked, carried messages, took risks, helped make peace. And what did they get for it? They got treated like hostile Indians anyway, locked up, hauled off to Florida, tossed into the same damn pile as the men they helped surrender. That ain't a mistake. That's a system covering its backside. And it didn't stop with 2 scouts. More than 200 Apache scouts and their families were shipped east with Geronimo's people. Some had already done what Washington told them to do. Live here. Obey this. Trust us. Yeah, trust us. That phrase has buried a lot of decent people. I'm a law and order man, but don't sell me rot gut and call it justice. A badge can keep peace, sure. It can also hide a coward. A uniform can serve honor. It can also make theft look official. A promise is still a promise, even when the government loses the paper. So I'll ask you this. When the record lies clean, and the wounded still remember dirty, which one are you going to believe?